Yeah, so this is for the 230 people. I said I was going to open the seminar slot tomorrow, even though we've got no more presentations. Well, I've got to go down to Niagara tomorrow morning, so I won't be able to attend it. But if anybody's interested in having a sort of hour session sometime, if they email me or just put it in the chat area, I'll kind of book a time for that. Just to, talk about anything you want, really, isn't it? But tomorrow I was hoping, like I said, to be there for the seminar, but because I've been called away, I won't be able to do it tomorrow. If you see the seminar cancelled, that's the reason why. And talk about seminars, we added the scores up over the weekend. I don't feel good today. I'm not COVID. And I thought the presentations were really good. I thought everyone did well under the circumstances, because, as you see, it's a special time. But I've put the marks up for the group presentation. That's the 3230 people, not the 3240. All right. And whilst we're on the sort of course link, I just want to bring your attention to assignment 4, which is a final assignment. And as we mentioned on Friday, it's about choosing the CCPs. So in this one, what I've done is I've given you the flow diagram to make a raw milk cheese, Gouda to be exact. And all you have to do is you look at the product description. Now, those who haven't done cheese before, I can tell you that cheese is classified based on its moisture content. So if you've got a Gouda, for example, which is a semi-hard cheese, that has a certain moisture content. I won't give the game away what the moisture content is, because I think it'll be good for you to research it. Oddly enough, the pH of cheese isn't used as a sort of characteristic to define growth or no growth. And the reason for that is because the pH can change through the ripening period if you have ripening cheeses. So, but there is a kind of pH traditional for a Gouda cheese. And again, you can put that down as well. So you go on the internet or to your favorite cheese book and you find out the percent moisture. And also what you do, because you'll need that for the characterization, as you probably know. But then after that, you can go and try to identify the microbial hazards. I don't know if I was going to ask you if anybody wants to have a guess at one, but I don't think anyone will reply to me anyway. So just think about the microbial hazard. I'll give you a clue then. Think about what could be linked to the raw material and also what can be acquired from the processing environment. So I won't tell the answer because, like I said, I'll spoil the surprise. And then all you have to do is go through those decision tree that we talked about on Friday. Those sort of questions you ask. One, does this step eliminate the hazard? Does it contribute, or is there a subsequent step after that that can control the hazard? So you literally go down and you choose the CCPs. And that's all there is to it. You don't have to do anything else. And again, I forget what deadline. I'll just check on the Dropbox for that. I think it's next week, if I remember rightly, but I can't remember. Oh well, we all got the grammar. Anyway, where are we going? Oh yeah, so assignment 4 then is due on the 5th. Some people have done it already, but it's due on the 5th of December. And as I keep going on about, the final exam will be between the 9th and the 16th of December. I'll talk about it more on Friday after we've finished everything. And like I mentioned, it's going to be very similar to the midterm. All right, everyone good? I think that's a yes. I never can tell. Just before we start the lecture, though, I thought it was interesting. I saw this on the Twitter feed the other day. And we talked about inspection and how, in the early days, it was literally a branch of the police force. They used to go investigating adulteration and things like that. And then it came in, over this sort of time in the 30s, 50s, 60s, right up to the present day, I suppose. It became more of a sort of inspection branch where they would just kind of go around inspecting all the food facilities and things like that. Very inefficient when you think about it. It's a bit like I always say, like police just coming down door to door saying, "Are you doing things right?" and things like that. But over in Europe and a bit in the US, I would say, they're starting to do return, if you want, to the police investigative kind of style. And over in the UK, I saw this job for the National Food Crime Unit. So the National Food Crime Unit, as the name suggests, goes investigating things like food fraud and those processes who are acting illegally. And a lot of ways, the sort of efficiency of a job is much better, isn't it? Because most players in the food industry do the right thing. It's only those ones that don't do the right thing. And if you've got a very blanket inspection system, you always miss those. So it's interesting. I don't think you get MI6 license to kill or anything with this position, but I wouldn't be surprised if over here in Canada we get kind of an investigative division. Hopefully, there's quite a few interesting stories. I won't dwell on them because I'm distracting. This product here was, I think, it was sold in Nova Scotia. Basically bottled meat. It's a botulism nightmare, isn't it? And they found those out, and I think it was the yeast one's an interesting one. That's another thing. Anyway, I'm digressing. All right, so we better get on with things, as I say. We said whittle. So when we left it on Friday, then we're talking about food safety management systems and how HACCP has really become one of the, well, it did come to the forefront one. It did become, I was going to say if you could do this again, but I don't think you can do the question again. How HACCP really became established as the food safety system, after the sort of food scares of the 90s and the 80s and the 90s. And once it became established, the reason why we got it in the 90s is that we could do a staged approach, going from the 7 steps of HACCP in terms of identifying hazards, then from identifying hazards to finding out the critical control points. And as we did on this map, when we looked for the CCPs, everybody kind of clicked everywhere, which isn't a surprise, for the simple reason that that's what used to happen in the early days. You used to have a lot of CCPs, and the problem with lots of CCPs becomes unmanageable, i.e. you're trying to control everything at once rather than the critical parts. So what they did is you have a decision tree, and you go through those 3 questions, which are just relayed, and you identify where the critical control points are. And these critical control points are away from the preventive control points, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So you go through the decision tree, you identify your critical control points, and then you've got to find your critical limits. So critical limits define your control points or critical control points under control. So obvious ones is time and temperature. The temperature of the pasteurizer doesn't go below 20 degrees C for a certain amount of time. And when it goes out of those limits, you've got to have corrective action to get it back in. What do you do with the product that's gone through? Do you rework it? Do you divert it? All written plan. You don't need to go running after your supervisor because you want to control it as quick as you can and bring it under control. And as we talked about, these critical limits of monitoring are real time. So it's not a case, you can't do microbial counts because they take so long to come through. So you do things like time, temperature, inspection, rapid pH readings or things like that. I think you get the idea. All right, so once you've got your CCPs and your corrective actions, you've got to do your monitoring, as we talked about. Oh dear. And then after that, you've got, I'm trying to establish corrective actions to get them back under gear. And the other thing about corrective actions is that they help you learn from mistakes. So I don't know if you saw the racing yesterday, the Formula One, where this poor Roman Grosjean went into the side of a rail and blew up. Very spectacular. But, it's kind of, they're going to learn from those mistakes there in terms of how do you prevent that happening. And coming back to the more mundane making food products. When you have a sort of drift out to your sort of critical limit, be it a pasteurizer, be it or anything else, you try to learn from that lesson and write it into the revised HACCP plan to stop it happening again. Because the fundamental part of HACCP is a preventive approach, trying to identify the hazards and making sure they don't happen again. Record keeping is a very big thing in HACCP. Everything has to be documented. If it's not documented, it didn't happen. And so you'll get actual firms who will say, yes, we can give you a HACCP documentation program. And it's more critical than ever because these days you need to be able to bring your records forward within 48 hours. There was an event at XL Foods over in Alberta where they got an incident, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And they had to get their records for the CFIA to look at. And they said, well, they're not actually here. They're up in Edmonton. So it took them, 4 days just to get them together and then send them down. So documentation is everything. And this is one of the downfalls of HACCP. People say it's just a paper exercise. It doesn't really focus on important parts. But we'll talk about that. Now, when we left it on Friday, I think we got to the verification part, which was talking about, does the HACCP plan work? So this is where the microbiology comes in. So here, for example, if you're doing a poultry line, you've got to attain certain standards for salmonella. I think it's less than 20%, and I think it's Campylobacter less than 13% positive out of 300 carcasses. And so that's your verification. So if your HACCP plan is working right, you've got all those steps in place to prevent salmonella and Campylobacter, then your prevalence at the end will be low. It'll be within spec. Sometimes it's not, and if it's not, we have to revise the HACCP plan. But other than doing microbial checks in terms of pathogen prevalence, maybe the total aerobic count of certain products and mold count, you also look at the documents. So you'll get an auditor in, and they'll look over your books and say, oh, yes, I noticed you had this corrective action. And they'll just kind of look through your HACCP plan to see what's been happening in the plan. Now, more often than not, when people come to do audits, they say we've had no corrective actions, everything worked fine. The auditor automatically gets suspicious because nothing works perfectly. And so they kind of come in and have a look at the records for you, and then before the government audit comes in. So it's just basically looking at different documentation, seeing if you've revised the plan, taking new hazards into account. So, for example, in the bakery sector, when we had the E. coli 026 outbreak with flour, you had to put in your HACCP plan saying, how are you going to tackle E. coli 026 in flour? So these are the sort of things that you do. Now, if you take the food safety management course next semester, which is online, which is another course delivered by me, I don't know if that's good or bad, but we'll talk about auditing and how we have different levels of auditing. The first party auditing is where it's internal. The second part of auditing is getting somebody from outside to do I won't say a formal audit, but somebody in a fresh set of eyes. It can be somebody from another company, it can be somebody from the same company, but not totally involved. And then get the third party audits, which are government inspectors. And as we talk about later on, is that these third party audits can also be done by consultants like NSF, which is in Guelph on Chancellor's Way, I think it is. And they get a lot of money for this. So basically, these are the independents who come in and say your HACCP plan is good or bad. So the thing about HACCP then, as I mentioned to you, in the 90s when it was introduced, it was really mandatory to those sort of food commodities that were a big issue. So things like meat and poultry, seafood and canned foods. And these fell under the sort of regulation of the USDA. Now, as we talked about back in the sort of 30s, the FDA split from the USDA. The USDA's job is to promote agriculture. FDA's job is to look after the public. So the thing was, though, the USDA got the easy job. Well, easy job, I think it's quite easy. But they got these mandatory HACCP, which basically meant they had prescriptive regulations. So when we say prescriptive, we literally mean they tell you what the hazards are, they tell you what the CCPs are, they'll tell you what the limits are. Everything's written down for you. Now, the FDA were a bit more relaxed about it, saying, well, you know, we haven't got time to do all these different commodities. So what we're going to do is HACCP-based systems. And really, these HACCP-based systems are HACCP, but just in name. So they have what we call generic models. And if you go into the archives of the CFIA, you'll see these generic models. And these are basically based on GMP, good manufacturing practice and sanitation. They're not product specific, they're commodity specific to a degree, but they're not. It's a lazy person's way of doing things. I think that's the word, isn't it? Now, the thing with HACCP, and when it got introduced back in the 90s, when it got introduced in the 90s, you know, people held it as a real breakthrough. And sure enough, in the early days, it did. The E. coli incidents came down, a few of the salmonellas did. But then they seemed to reach a plateau. You know, the Vibrio actually went up for reasons we talked about before. So what HACCP had a temporary effect, but people were getting a bit disillusioned by it. And the reason why that was the case is because really, when we think about HACCP, it was not really a nil defects, is it? And when we say that is HACCP principle was the fact that it was a preventive control, 0 defects, but we allowed a certain amount of salmonella, for example, in poultry. We allowed certain limits, so going back to the sampling unit we had. Nothing, you can't have 0 defects because one, it's impossible to prove, and two, I suppose it's impossible to gain. We had improved diagnostics, so whereas before we used to miss a lot of the incidents, we actually could detect it now. And the problem with these sensitive methods, isn't it, is that you detect you know, pathogens right down to 1 CFU per 25 grams, but then you get into this sort of cycle where you're saying, well, is that going to cause illness? Is that going to be significant? So diagnostics is another reason why HACCP didn't really come deliver. And the thing is, over the last 30 years, there's been a continuation of trading. The food industry's got much more complex. As we talked about in Unit 1, this push and pull, whereas you know, consumers go for clean labelling, which obviously affects the sort of safety of the product. The focus on documentation is probably one of the most significant. So as I mentioned to you, the trouble with HACCP is that everybody kind of focused on the paperwork. And if you ask somebody on the shop floor or the work floor, you know, have you seen the HACCP plan? They say no, because it was all the nice in binders and folders in an office somewhere, ready for the auditor to do. And when we come to the Excel Foods, and we've got many more examples, they basically had a nice HACCP plan, but they never applied it for the simple reason they just let the staff do what they want to do. And Excel Foods was a good example of that. The thing with HACCP as well to remember is that the whole point of HACCP in a way was to give control of the food industry or food safety to the industry. Control, you know, some people say, well, it's like leaving the fox in charge of the coop, as they call it, the chicken coop, which could be totally right. You know, basically the regulators stood back and they said, right, industry, you sort yourselves out in terms of developing a HACCP plan and monitoring it. And, you know, when you give it that kind of power, and it's like saying, well, you go down the 401, don't worry about speed limits, just regulate yourself. And, you know, it'd be like, well, it's a sort of speedway, isn't it? The other issue about HACCP, Dan, is that it's descriptive. As I said, the FDA got quite lazy, same here in Canada. And when we say descriptive, we're basically saying, well, industry, you make it up. We'll give you a guideline. We'll give you a generic plan to base it on, but it's up to you to make your own plan up to you to decide what limits you want, up to you to decide what hazards to look at, things like that. And so this all led to an inconsistent HACCP plan. So typically all you had to do was have a HACCP plan, And you could say, well, is that good or bad HACCP plan? And your auditor would come in and your auditor would say that's a good one. But then later on, another auditor could come in and say that's a bad one. It's this subjectivity, because auditing, as we'll say, is a weak link. So based on this background then, it's obvious that HACCP itself had a initial beneficial, but after that, it seems to have plateaued. There seems to be something wrong with the HACCP. How could it be improved? Well, the industry looked at itself, as it usually does, and say, look, we will open a global food safety initiative. We'll establish this to get a standardized HACCP. If a HACCP system's produced with GFSI certification, then it must be good. Whether it's in China, whether it's in the US, whether it's in Mexico, whether it's in England, anything like that. Now, the government, in its own other way, decided to say, well, yes, we need to change things up. So we're going to have Modernization Act. And in the US, they had the Food Safety Modernization Act, which was introduced after 9/11. I'll tell you that story a bit later. And in Canada, because we had to react to what the US were doing, because they're our big trading partners, we kind of aligned with them, say, oh, yes, so we'll certainly have to modernize our sort of acts as well. The obvious reason, they say they did it independently, but the reality is they did it in response to the US. That's the way the world works, trading partners and all that. All right, then. So the industry then, especially retailers, because retailers are king, they say what happens. They say, as you probably guess, they have total control. And the GFSI then was a global sort of consortium of research, some processors, they've got to have some say in it, but mainly retailers. And what their sort of goal was, what their goal was to introduce a standard for HACCP systems. So, as I said before, a HACCP system of one facility was compared to another HACCP system, there wasn't any equivalency there. And this is what the GFSI did. So now they're not regulators, they can't make law, but they can make guidelines, and they can say, well, if you want to supply Walmart, you have to be GFSI certified or have recognition. And so basically what the sort of initiative was to do is to bring in this sort of consistent HACCP standard, and thereby reducing the need for multiple audits. So anytime you go to industry, what you'll see is that they'll be saying, oh, I've got an audit this week, and then next week they've got another audit. They have all these different auditors coming in from all these different retailers. So retail say, well, if we had a standard, we just need to send one auditor in. Now, the reality is it's not quite that easy, but I think you get the idea. So the thing about GFSI to remember is that it's not a regulatory body. It's not even really a standard. What they do is they're a sort of group of so-called experts that sit round for a given commodity, and they say, well, if you're producing baked bread, these are the sort of categories you need to consider: GMP, traceability, facility design. And so this kind of body, I don't know where they're based now, but they kind of issue documents. If you're really bored one day, you can go to the GFSI website and you'll see all these sort of guidelines and recommendations they have. So essentially what they do then is they don't give any standards out. They don't even give any regulations out, but they identify the categories, what should be considered. So this can be food safety manual, internal audit, corrective actions. And they kind of say that you've got to consider these. Now, the companies actually do the standards, are these what we call certified by the GFSI. So it's the big ones, and there's about 7 or 8 of them. The ones over here in the US and Canada are the SQF, the Safe Quality Food, and ones over in Europe are usually the BRC, which is the British Retail Consortium, and the popular one, if you want to call it popular, is the Food Safety System Certificate. So the thing to remember with these are what we call the standards organisation. So these take the categories that have been approved by the GFSI and start putting standards on them. Saying we expect you to have a traceability system containing X, Y, and Z. Now, they do it kind of differently. Like anybody, and like I say, we'll talk about this if you ever take the food safety management course. Yeah, the food safety system certificate, the FSSS 22000, is more ISO based. SQF has got 3 levels, you know, very simple. British Retail Consortium, a bit like the ISO standard. But the important thing is that these are recognised schemes. So it's no good at analogies, but GFSI approves what the SQF is because it takes into account all those kind of elements that they looked at during benchmarking. So the GFSI then is above the regulation. It goes beyond, they say. And, you know, we talked about ISO being a kind of competitive, not competitive, but another sort of food safety system. Well, they can introduce ISO in HACCP because it's a standard method for introducing HACCP. So, you know, a company, say in France, and a company here in Canada, if they're following the same sort of GFSI certified scheme, they have to have a standard of what their HACCP plan actually constitutes or what it contains. That's where the ISO comes back in again. So, you know, they kind of said, look, this is superior. Not only have you got a good HACCP scheme, you've got equivalency. There's so if you're a retailer buying in from anywhere in the world, you can be assured of a certain quality. Now, the kingpin of all this GFSI is the auditing. So what the auditor does, and these are certified auditors, and if you ever want a position, you don't do your bioinformatics, you don't do your CFA inspector, you can become an auditor, and these get paid a lot of money for doing very little, so it's a good job. But anyway, so the thing about auditing is that these are the people who go to your company and they'll look at your HACCP plan, look at the layout, and they'll say 5 stars or good, excellent, you name it. And these auditors are paid by the processor to come in. And like I say, it's not cheap. I think I heard $30,000 for 3 days' work. Not bad, is it? So basically, they have all these different audit companies. And as you probably guessed, is that these auditors approve your HACCP plan. Oh, yeah, this is a good question. All right, then. So the thing about auditors, then, they are paid by the company to come in and say, is their HACCP plan good or bad? Now, the thing with auditing is that a bit like the original HACCP, I guess, it's very subjective. You could be a hard auditor. You know, you could say, oh, you know, this is really bad. Or you could be a very soft auditor and say, oh, no problem. Now, the problem with auditing, because they're paid for by the processor, you know, it's a bit like, well, I don't like that auditor, so I'm not going to PMA, I'm going to NSF to get their auditor because their auditor gives me good reports. And just to illustrate the inherent weakness of auditing, there's 4 outbreaks here, and just try and figure out which is the odd one out. Is it the Peanut Corporation of America that caused over 500 cases of salmonella with their peanut paste when they were sending out product that was known to be contaminated? Was it XL Foods, which we talked about a little bit, that caused over 2,000 product lines because they weren't following the HACCP plan? Was it the Jensen brothers who managed to go organic, so took all the chlorine and things like that out and caused 147 cases of listeriosis and 33 deaths? Or was it the egg people, DeCosta, who basically made 500 people sick with salmonella? Oh, see, it's all right. I'll just, because I've got to get on. Right, so, oh, close. So those who picked DeCosta's right. So the story goes, and that the common feature of these 3, the Peanut Corporation of America, XL Foods, and Jensen Brothers, is that a month before they had these massive outbreaks, they got excellent audits. They basically got 5 out of 5 in the Peanut Corporation, very good for XL Foods, and the Jensen Brothers got excellent for theirs. Now, the reason why DeCosta's the odd one out is that he actually paid for his. Is he bribed the auditor physically? So, well, not only bribed the auditor, I think he bribed the FDA inspector as well, which wasn't a good move. They got locked up for life. I think they're appealing the sentence, but they get a bit rough, don't they? So this is the thing with auditing, is that it became, and it has become, basically a score inflation. When we talk about marks in courses and how, the marks get inflated to make it look like the course is a success. Well, very much like auditing, is that the SQF, for example, will give you a percentage. And if you don't get more than 95% in an SQF audit, people say, wow, that must be really bad. But when you think about it, it's ridiculous, isn't it? But this is what the inherent weakness of auditing is. And exists today. Like auditing, some people say it's not worth the paper it's written on, which is probably true. So that was the GFSI, but in government, they modernized as well. And in the US, they started the process in 2001, and it was under the sort of 9/11 attacks. And you might be thinking, well, what's the 9/11 attacks got to do with food safety? Well, what they do in the US, they kind of sneak acts in under different acts. So we had the Patriot Act, which was all, defense and all this. But they kind of shuffled in the Food Safety Modernization Act. And this is the reason why there's a category of bioterrorism, radiology, and bioterrorism attacks. It's not there because we expect to be attacked, so the food system to be attacked. It's there so they can kind of link it to the Patriot Act and all that. But anyway, the reason why they wanted to modernize is because a lot of the acts that they had become out of date. You were talking about the Meat and Poultry Act from years ago. It wasn't reflective of modern day production. And also what we found, isn't it, over the years, is that although meat still contributes a lot to foodborne illness outbreaks, fresh produce is the leading cause of outbreaks. So we had to kind of take that in as well. There was new hazards, we had E. coli 0157, we had listeria from the 80s. And the real problem is, as I mentioned, these generic plans, what the FDA and CFIA came up with for non-mandatory HACCP, they were basically just generic. There wasn't any sort of science behind them. It was very subjective, as we talked about in all those different cases. But one of the cynical side of people is that they wanted greater flexibility in the inspection service. So what they really mean by that is say we can give more power to the industry, use less inspectors. And those inspectors we have, we can actually get them to be more roaming, as we say. They're not specializing in meat or fish or dairy. They can do all of them. And this is what happened in the Safe Foods for Canadians Act. So better or for worse, basically makes for a reduced inspection system. And like I mentioned, the industry taking control of itself. So FSMA, as it was then, is that it took over 10 years just to get to congressional pass, and then it took another sort of 6 years to get the regulations. And really what it was based on, as I mentioned to you at the start, HACCP was based on this prerequisite program followed by the HACCP plan, staged, listed. So they got rid of all that and said, right, we're going to have risk prevention controls rather than CCPs. And risk prevention controls are essentially taking all the prerequisite programs and the HACCP plan and just putting it together in one. The very reason why the HACCP didn't succeed back in the 70s. But anyway, that's what they did. So risk prevention controls, which we'll talk about, they had importer verification. So this is basically in the US saying, if you want to import into the US, you have to follow US policy and standards. They had this biodefense one because it was linked to 9/11. And also they had these greater partnerships. So really what that means is that they were going to rely much more on state municipal inspection services, very much like Canada does. So in Canada, the CFIA is federal, but they do depend on the provincial and municipal food inspection to assist them. So they're not kind of independent. And rather than having a HACCP plan, you have what we call a food safety plan. Right, so the Safe Food for Canadians Act is our version of the Modernisation Act. It followed the FSMA very closely. I would say it's around about 2012, but then they saw where the FSMA was going and they didn't like that place at all, because the Safe Food for Canadians Act recognised that what we have isn't bad. It is, yeah, it could be better, but getting rid of HACCP isn't the best way. So we kind of kept HACCP, but we had to align to the US because they're our big trading partner. So we had to bring in risk prevention controls. But, as we'll talk about, we kind of did it in name only, not really by in the true spirit that they do. Rather than having this important verification, so sending somebody over to Mexico to say, are you doing the right thing? What they did is they issued licenses. So this basically means that if you wanted to import it to Canada, you have to hold this license. And this license is given to you after you've proven yourself to be reliable and follow the Canadian way. You have traceability systems. You hear a lot about blockchain, for example, for better or for worse. But the wanted traceability, the recognition of foreign systems, basically rather tthan having equivalency, they say, well, is your system, I get like Europeans have different rules. Australia, New Zealand have, South America does, and all that. So is it the equivalent system? And you had labeling, nutritional things, animal welfare. And what they had is a risk prevention control plan, which is like a HACCP plan, literally, but it's just a different name. So I think you get the idea. So as I mentioned to you, FSMA took 10 years just to get to the point of the act being passed, and then it took another 6 years for regulations to be introduced. And this is a problem, whereas the GFSI was industry-led, which basically meant they could they don't need to answer 21, so they could really do a rapid expansion of the GFSI, which they did, because they had the processes, blackmailing them, say, well, if you're not GFSI certified, you're not selling in our stores. So they had that kind of power. But with the US system, then FSMA took 10 years and then another 5 years. And the thing about the FSMA system is that they have what we call final rules, and that's their regulation. So the fresh produce rule was the first one to be rolled out. Oddly enough, they rolled it back in again because it's under revision right at the moment. But it's reflective of saying, well, fresh produce is the main concern. But when they did roll it out, the industry said, no, we can't do this. We can't start treating irrigation water, actually doing all this testing you require us to do. So they actually rolled it back in again. But there was other regulation and final rules like the human animal foods, which are basically standards for food. The foreign supply verification, all companies exporting to the US must work under FSMA regulation. The transport rule is where transporters needed to log what they were carrying, the temperature of it, the standard they have in terms of sanitation, all this. And the mitigation is not international, it's intentional, intentional adulteration. This came to, again, the sort of bioterrorism aspect to it, where they said it was a criminal offence to adulterate food. And you might think, well, that's obvious, but it wasn't. There was a few years ago, there was some people, well, two people specifically, who were planting needles in bacon and ham products here in Guelph. And when they got caught, they couldn't be prosecuted criminally because there was no rules. So they got kind of fined. I forget what the sort of charge was. But with the Modernisation Act, it's actually a criminal offence now to adulterate food. So if you go, well, I don't think you will, but if you go to start putting needles in products now, you're looking at 10 years in prison, $5 million fine, which is a bit different, isn't it? But I wouldn't recommend it, definitely. So the supply verification, as I mentioned, was this sort of requirement to have the products produced under the same standards as US. And the problem is that they had to send out auditors to basically audit these companies. And not only that, but they also had to have a representative in the US. So if something went wrong, they can collar somebody. And there was actually one incident, which won't go on about now because I'm running out of time, where they actually did find a sort of adulteration of a batch of tuna, and they got this poor distributor in California and they threw the book at them. So that's what they kind of do. And whereas the Canadian system's different, is that we work under a license system. You don't need to have a rep here. So to go back a step then, as I mentioned to you, the whole thing about HACCP was this prerequisite program followed by the HACCP plan. It took about 7 years to implement. What they did is got rid of that. Say, right, we're not having a HACCP plan anymore. We're having a hazard analysis, risk-based prevention control. Now, in HACCP, it's got the kind of fundamentals of HACCP in terms of you identify the hazards, which can be chemical, physical, or microbial, but it's a very different way of doing it. So without prerequisite programs, everything is considered, and you identify the preventive controls to control a certain risk. So what we're saying there is that a preventive control could be a pasteurizer, a preventive control could be sanitizer or sanitation, GMP, all things like that. So rather than having these critical limits that we talked about and monitoring them, you have what we call an outcomes based. So in this system, so say for example, you're producing, I don't know, candy apples, and because it's ready to eat, there's zero tolerance for listeria. So what it's saying there is they're saying to you, you can do anything you like or within reason. And as long as your product at the end of the line has no listeria in, we're good with that. So you don't have this sort of CCPs, you don't have these critical limits, but you do have these preventive controls. And in the US also what you have to do is have what we call a PCQI or a preventive control qualified individual. So yeah, we talked about positions, be it bioinformatics, be it inspectors. This PCQI is, you'd go to training for about a week, I think, or 2 days to a week, and you become trained in preventive controls. And every company that exports to the US or in the US needs to have this person. So you could imagine if you've got this certification, you become valuable to companies. And the thing about this PCQI person is that they become the HACCP team. So where we had all these different people, expertise from engineers to quality assurance people, it came down to one person. And the thing about preventive controls then is that it's all those things, GMP, sanitation, interventions, all accounted as preventive control. So if you like, you get a hazard, a hazard list, and you've got to assign a preventive control that's used to control them. So for example, you might say listeria, it's sanitation and high pressure processing, things like this. So just to give you a bit of practice, because I would go through painful detail on this, but what do you think of this one? So we talk about preventive controls. So say you're doing omelettes for whatever reason. Salmonella is an obvious hazard, but what do you think would be the preventive controls? Oh, hang on. I've cut you off there, haven't I? There you go. So what would be the preventive controls used in omelette production? So salmonella is an obvious hazard because that's linked to eggs. It's raw. Would it be the assurance of a single assurance raw material? Would it be the cooking, refrigeration, all of the above, or some of them? Right, let's have a look. I think most people would have got this right. Oh, very split. Well, not very split, is it? Yeah, so it's basically all of the above. So as always with HACCP, what they depend on, for better or worse, is a certificate of analysis or assurance for the raw material. So what that tells you is that the supplier of that raw material has done all they can to ensure that it's not got salmonella in or E. coli, things like that. Obviously, the cooking step for the omelette is going to be a preventive control, because that's where you're going to inactivate the salmonella. And refrigeration, because again, you're controlling the growth of any residual salmonella if it's there. So this is the way the preventive control plan works. And I think you might have guessed by now, but if you don't guess now, I think when you go to industry and apply this, it's got all those reasons why HACCP was done in a staged approach before. You know, the preventive control program is so complex, and when they tried to introduce HARP-C into the US system, there was uproar. The industry said, we don't understand what's going on. We don't can't manage this. We had a perfectly good system under HACCP and a GFSI. Now you come in and you kind of blown everything up, which they exactly did. Not going backing down either, which is interesting. Oh, so right. So the thing about it then is that, as I say, the companies were saying, look, we've had GFSI since 2000. We've got all these nice systems in place. We've got a standardized HACCP. But the thing is that they're inherently different. FSMA is the law because it's made by the government, and it's really based on these preventive controls. So what the GFSI, I guess, was hoping for is saying, look, if we get an early start and we give the government this sort of HACCP plus system where we can assure standards and that, we should be good. But the government didn't have any kind of known for that and said, no, we're going to do it our way. So GFSI had to kind of, I don't like the word pivot, but it had to pivot in order to re-establish itself. So again, it's very similar, but it's just like the way they approach things in terms of emphasizing the bioterrorism control and how they implement the preventive control. So as I mentioned to you, once they produced Hep C, it was basically the industry got all confused. They didn't know about hazard analysis because they literally, unlike being prescriptive like it should have been, they were kind of saying, well, not only have you got to list the hazards, but you've also now got to see the foreseen hazards. So, for example, the fire in E. coli 26, they said, well, you shouldn't be able to predict that. You know, how could you predict that? So the industry was really confused with that. They didn't know about validation, which might sound alarming, but you've got to remember there are a lot of companies out there don't understand what they want to achieve. They didn't have a good recall plan because back in the day, it was one step forward, one step back. So essentially what that meant was that you had to know where your product was going, the next stage, and you need to know where your ingredients came from, the step back. But now what they were saying in the Modernisation Act, say you've got to have a whole chain where, you know, this is where they're promoting blockchain, which is, you know, Frank Yarnis is on the FDA's kind of pet, but it's a very expensive way of doing things, and you know the industry don't like that either. The failure to enforce the preventive controls because they didn't know what they were, and as I say, they weren't really sure what to ask the suppliers in terms of letters of assurance. So in a lot of ways, it's been a disaster. But yeah, the FDA are putting a brave face on it, saying, "Oh, you know, it's early days yet. It's going to work in the end." But you can see it's a disaster, isn't it? But as I said to you, Canada was following the US very closely to a point. But when they started talking about Hep C, you know, the CFAA said, hang on, this is going down a path we don't want, which is true. You know, why do you throw out all those good work you've done over the years? So what they did, they split off into what we call a preventive control plan. Now, the preventive control plan is administered on the federal level. And unlike the US, which has got the USDA and FDA, we have one single federal agency. Now, people complain about it, saying, well, you know, the CFAA are in the hands of the industry, which I must admit, you know, they were actually in the Department of Industry for a long time. And there is this sort of conflict of interest. And if you look at the listeria outbreak in Maple Leaf Foods, Jerry Ritz, for example, he was very pro-industry. He kind of he was defending Maple Leaf for sicking all these people. And after that sort of incident, the outbreak, you know, CFAA got moved to the Department of Health, but really the same people just moved along. So you didn't have any, anyway, I'm digressing. So the thing about our federal system is that it took different aspects of the inspection system, you know, because we had one inspectorate for the fish, one for dairy, things like that, and they put them together. The ASC are the kind of research branch of the government, but we had the CFAA, and what the CFAA did is then go into these different branches for the meat, for the fish, for the dairy and the eggs. And what the Modernisation Act said, oh, we're going to get rid of all that. We're just going to have one. So one inspector can inspect all these different products. So to aid them, they a few years ago, this was the Food safety enhancement program. So essentially, this is a mandatory HACCP. And what they did is that, a bit like the USDA, they gave what we call prescriptive. So if you get bored, you can go online and you can see the meat inspection manual, and you'll see how detailed it is. But then they said, well, we could use a food safety enhancement program for general HACCP-based systems, which they did, and it had the net effect of the sort of generic plans which people didn't understand. So they introduced the Safe Food for Canadians Act, and if you get bored one day, or you take food safety management next semester, we talk a lot about this. So you can go to the Safe Food for Canadians Act, and what you'll see is all these different parts and subdivisions. And when you read through it, you say, well, this is just HACCP, but in a different format, because you have prerequisite programs and you have commodity-specific requirements. So in a lot of ways, they're going towards this prescriptive ones for different products like fruit and vegetables and things like that, if you get my meaning. So the Safe Food for Canadians Act, it's actually going through, it got held up a little bit with COVID. So this year, for example, where all these commodities would fall under the FSEP or QMP, they've been delayed. So, it's a bit like halfway house. A lot of facilities are still working under GFSI and things like that, whereas this move towards the sort of Safe Food for Canadians Act is ongoing. But the key point is, and I think you've guessed this, is that the GFSI is very similar to what the Safe Food for Canadians Act is. So it's a much more easier fit than the US system. So as I mentioned to you, there is differences between the Safe Food for Canadians Act and FSMA in terms of, we don't worry about, we have this staged approach, a prereqs, and then your HACCP plan. You don't need a PCQI unless you're exporting to the US. You don't need a biodefense plan because ours is based on the 9/11. We have a preventive control plan, which basically is another word for HACCP. The US has HARP-C, which is a total disaster, but people use it. And we don't need supply verification. We just need a licensing. With all these different things. So the impacts of the Safe Food for Canadians Act, though, has been to kind of simplify the inspection service, allowed it much easier for people to import into Canada. Whereas before, they needed to follow 7 acts, they could just do one now. But it has been a burden. And the other thing about it is that it's given the CFIA a lot of power. So before, the CFIA could come into your facility, then when they saw something wrong, they could go to the ministry and say, we want a court order to close them down. It would go through judges and whatnot. But now a CFIA inspector could come in and shut your place down. Yeah, they had to have a reason, obviously, but then the flex of power in these sort of free ones, like Regency Meat Packers, they were following HACCP. And because they didn't follow the Safe Food for Canadians Act forming, just the forms they write on, they literally closed them down. Same with St. Anne Meat Packers and the Fairway Bakery. It wasn't because of safety, it was because they had the wrong form. And that's, this is a trouble. When you give power, it corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, something like that. So last question, I know we're running over time. Given your knowledge of FSMA then and the Safe Food Canadians Act, so obviously we're diverging now. One's keeping with the HACCP, one's keeping with HARP-C. Like, which one do you think is going to be more effective in the future? Do you think, under FSMA, they're going to have so many, it's just growing pains essentially? Or do you think there's some other reason? Oh. Yeah, well, it's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? There's no kind of firm answer because, at the front of it, you say, well, the Safe Food for Canadians Act is kind of going on the same old way. It's proven. But, as we talked about, HACCP is limited. Now, the HARP-C, you could see in some ways saying, well, yeah, it's a different way of doing things. We should be able to apply both together. We should be able to have it prescriptive. And there are people who are suggesting that the HARP-C approach is good. But the problem with HARP-C, unlike HACCP, it's not really globally recognized. It was made by Congress, approved by the US, and I think they just assumed that the whole world would, go with the flow, but they don't. So the secret about HACCP is that it was globally recognized, I think, and basically people recognized it. Was Hep C more like a trade barrier? But anyway, history will tell, and we'll see how it is. All right, so that'll be it for today, and then on Wednesday we're going to start parasites, and we should finish, touch wood, in timely fashion.